Montana Territory, 1877. A harsh winter wind swept across the empty streets of Whitetail Creek, carrying with it the bitter promise of an early snowfall. Barren branches of cottonwoods clawed at a steel-gray sky as Benjamin Jameson pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders. At 25, Ben had already seen enough of the West's cruelty to last several lifetimes. 6 years of driving cattle, breaking horses, and sleeping under stars had hardened him into the kind of man who survived out here, alone. That was the only way to live in this untamed country, alone, self-sufficient. Needing no one and nothing but your own two hands and whatever they could provide. The moment you started depending on others was the moment you started dying. Ben had learned that lesson watching his father waste away after his mother's passing. A strong man reduced to a hollow shell by something as foolish as love. Ben wouldn't make the same mistake. The West demanded strength, and strength meant standing alone. His boots crunched against the hard-packed dirt of Whitetail Creek's main street as he made his way toward Donovan's general store. The settlement barely qualified as a town, just a collection of desperate souls clinging to the edge of civilization, trying to carve something permanent from the wilderness. Ben didn't count himself among them. He worked at the R Ranch 15 miles outside town, and only ventured in when supplies ran low or the loneliness of the line shack drove him to seek human voices, however briefly. Today it was coffee and ammunition that brought him to town. The coffee because winter was coming, and cold nights required something warm in your belly. The ammunition because wolves had been growing bold around the R's south pasture. Both were necessities for survival, nothing more. He was nearly to Donovan's when he saw her. She stood with her back to him, shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat as she turned away from the store's entrance. Even from behind, there was something about her that made Ben slow his stride. Perhaps it was the rich chestnut color of her hair, gathered simply at the nape of her neck, or the way she held herself, proud despite whatever disappointment had just befallen her. Her dress was simple calico, faded from many washings but meticulously mended, not a woman of means but one of dignity. As she turned, Ben caught his first glimpse of her face, and something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was character in her features, strength and determination in the set of her jaw, intelligence in her clear green eyes, and a vulnerability that struck him harder than any physical blow. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, yet there was a weariness about her that spoke of hardships endured and overcome. She clutched a small leather pouch in one hand, opening it to peer inside before closing it again with a sigh that carried across the distance between them. Ben didn't know what made him approach her. It went against every rule he'd set for himself since leaving his father's homestead in Nebraska. Involvement led to attachment. Attachment led to dependency. Dependency led to pain when, not if, it was inevitably severed, yet his boots carried him toward her nonetheless. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat as his mother had taught him long ago, "forgive me for intruding, but you seem troubled. Is there something I might help with?" Up close she was even more striking. Her eyes weren't simply green, but a complex shade that reminded him of the high mountain meadows in springtime. A dusting of freckles crossed her nose, and a few strands of hair had escaped her simple bun to frame her face. She regarded him with caution, as any sensible woman would when approached by a stranger. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Donovan is simply unable to extend credit any further until next month. It's understandable." Ben glanced toward the store, then back to her. "You're in need of supplies." She straightened her shoulders. "Nothing that can't wait, Mr. Jameson," he supplied. "Benjamin Jameson, most just call me Ben." "Mr. Jameson," she acknowledged with a nod. "I appreciate your concern, but I wouldn't dream of troubling a stranger with my affairs." Ben should have tipped his hat, wished her good day, and continued on his errand. That would have been the sensible course of action, the safe course. Instead, he found himself saying, "Come with me, I'll fill your table tonight." The words surprised him as much as they clearly surprised her. Her eyes widened, and for a moment he feared she'd misunderstood his intention. "I meant," he clarified hastily, "I'm heading to hunt this afternoon. My cabin's well stocked, and I'd be happy to share some provisions. No strings attached, ma'am, just one neighbor helping another." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine what manner of man stood before her. Whatever she saw in his face must have reassured her, for some of the tension eased from her shoulders. "That's very kind," she said, "but I couldn't impose." It's no imposition if it's freely offered, Ben replied. Then, sensing her continued hesitation, he added, "At least let me purchase what you need today. You can repay me when you're able." Another long pause followed as she weighed his offer against her pride. "I'm Abigail Davis," she finally said. "My friends call me Abby." After another moment she added, "I've recently taken over my uncle's claim about 3 miles east of town. The harvest wasn't what I'd hoped, and winter's coming early this year." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Davis," Ben said. "Now, would you do me the honor of accepting my assistance? I promise it comes with no expectations, beyond the satisfaction of helping a neighbor." Something in his earnest tone must have convinced her, for she nodded once. "Very well, Mr. Jameson. I accept your kindness, though I insist on repayment at the earliest opportunity." "Fair enough," he agreed, gesturing toward the store entrance. As they walked side by side up the steps to Donovan's, Ben felt a strange sense of disruption, as if the careful walls he'd built around his life had just developed their first hairline crack. It was unsettling, yet not entirely unwelcome. He told himself it was nothing more than common decency. Anyone would have done the same, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. Most men in this territory looked after themselves and no one else. It was the only way to survive. So why had he stopped for this woman, and why did he find himself hoping this wouldn't be their last encounter? Inside the store, Ben observed how Abigail selected only essentials: flour, coffee, a small amount of sugar, lard, and salt. No luxuries, nothing excessive. She moved with purpose, calculating costs in her head as she went. When she reached for the cheapest grade of flour, Ben gently suggested the better quality. "Winter's long," he said. "Might as well have decent bread to see you through." "The cheaper flour stretches further," she countered. "And sits heavier in the stomach while providing less nourishment," he replied. "A poor economy in the end." She looked surprised at his reasoning but nodded thoughtfully and selected the better flour. Ben added his own supplies to the counter: coffee, ammunition, tobacco, and a few other necessities. Mr. Donovan, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, glanced between them with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Davis, I see you've made a friend. Good day to you, Jameson." "Donovan," Ben acknowledged with a nod. "Put it all on one bill if you would." The storekeeper's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing as he tallied their purchases. Ben paid without comment, and together they carried the supplies out to Ben's wagon. "I have a horse tied at the hitching post," Abigail said, nodding toward a sturdy bay mare. "I can manage from here, Mr. Jameson. You've been more than generous." "I'm heading east anyway," Ben heard himself say. "Let me drive you home." Again, his own words surprised him. He had no reason to go east today. His original plan had been to purchase his supplies and return immediately to the R. "That's not necessary," she began. "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but it would ease my mind to see you safely home with your provisions." "Those clouds don't look promising." He nodded toward the darkening sky. "Storms coming sooner than expected." Abigail glanced upward, assessing the thickening clouds with a practiced eye. After a moment of consideration, she nodded. "Very well, thank you." They secured her horse to the back of his wagon, loaded their supplies, and set out eastward. The first few miles passed in silence. Ben wasn't much for conversation at the best of times, and Abigail seemed lost in her own thoughts. Finally she spoke. "You mentioned hunting this afternoon. Are you a good shot, Mr. Jameson?" "Good enough," he replied, "and please call me Ben." "Ben," she repeated, testing the name. "Are there many deer in these parts?" "I haven't had much time for hunting, what with trying to get the claim in order." "Deer, rabbit, turkey when you're lucky," he said. "Game's getting scarcer as more settlers move in, but there's still enough if you know where to look." He glanced at her. "You hunt, Miss Davis." "Abby," she corrected with a small smile. "And yes, though it's been some time, my father taught me when I was young, said a woman alone in the world should know how to feed herself." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," she said quietly. The past tense hung between them, and Ben didn't press for details. After another mile, she pointed to a narrow track leading away from the main road. "My place is down there." Ben guided the wagon onto the rutted path, which wound through a stand of cottonwoods before opening onto a small clearing. A modest cabin stood at the center, smoke curling from its chimney. Beyond it stretched several acres of recently harvested fields, a small barn, and a chicken coop. It was a humble homestead, but Ben could see the care that had gone into maintaining it. "You live here alone?" he asked as he brought the wagon to a stop. "Yes," she replied simply. "My uncle passed this spring. The claim was his, but he left it to me in his will. I arrived from Illinois in June." Ben nodded, understanding better now. A woman on her own, taking over a claim just months before harvest, with no time to properly learn the land or prepare for winter. It was a precarious position. "It's a good piece of land," he observed, noting the creek that ran along one edge of the property. "Your uncle chose well." "He did," she agreed, a hint of pride in her voice. "Though I'm still learning its ways." They unloaded her supplies together, carrying everything into the cabin. The interior was small but meticulously kept. A cast iron stove dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a narrow bed was tucked into one corner. Shelves held a few books, cooking utensils, and jars of preserved foods, not enough to last the winter, Ben noted with concern. "Thank you again," Abigail said as they finished. She reached for her leather pouch. "I can offer you a small payment now, and the rest when—" Ben held up a hand. "There's no hurry," he said. "As I mentioned, I'm heading out to hunt. Would you object if I brought you a portion of whatever I take? It would help see you through until spring." She hesitated, clearly torn between pride and practicality. "Why would you do that for a stranger, Mr. Jam, Ben?" It was a fair question, and one Ben wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "Because winter's hard enough out here without facing it hungry," he said finally. "And because someone once helped me when I needed it." Their eyes met and something passed between them, a moment of understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Very well," she said softly. "I accept on the condition that you allow me to repay your kindness somehow." "Fair enough," Ben agreed. He glanced out the window at the darkening sky. "I should be going if I want to get any hunting done before that storm hits." "Be careful," she said, walking him to the door. "The weather turns quickly this time of year." "I've weathered a few Montana winters," he assured her with a small smile. "I'll be fine." As he drove away, Ben found himself looking back more than once at the small cabin. Something about Abigail Davis had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't quite explain. Her independence, her dignity in the face of hardship, her clear-eyed pragmatism, they reminded him of qualities he respected in himself. Yet there was a vulnerability there too, carefully hidden but visible to someone who knew what to look for. A woman alone, facing the brutal Montana winter with insufficient supplies and little support. The thought troubled him more than it should have. By the time he returned to the R that evening, the storm was breaking in earnest. The first heavy flakes of snow began to fall as he stabled his horse and carried his purchases to the lined shack he called home. Inside, he built up the fire and set coffee to boil, all the while thinking of Abigail Davis and her small, neat cabin 3 miles east of town. "You're a fool, Jameson," he muttered to himself as he sat by the fire. "Getting involved only brings trouble." But as the wind howled outside and the snow began to pile against the windows, he couldn't help wondering if she had enough firewood to last the night, if her stove was drawing properly, if she was warm enough in that cabin alone. For the first time in years, Benjamin Jameson's thoughts weren't solely focused on his own survival, and that, he knew, was a dangerous development indeed. The storm lasted 3 days, blanketing the territory in 2 feet of snow. As soon as the weather cleared, Ben saddled his horse and rode out to hunt as he'd promised. By mid-afternoon, he had taken a young buck, enough meat to last him weeks, with plenty to spare for Abigail. He should have sent a portion to her with one of the other hands. That would have been the sensible thing to do. Instead, he found himself butchering the deer, wrapping choice cuts in oilcloth, and loading them onto his horse for the ride to her homestead. The trail was difficult with the fresh snow, but Ben knew the territory well enough to make good time. The sun was beginning its descent when he arrived at Abigail's cabin. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, and as he approached, he saw her in the yard, chopping wood with determined strokes. She looked up at the sound of his horse, her face flushed from exertion, a few strands of chestnut hair escaping her woolen cap. For a moment, she simply stared, as if she hadn't really expected to see him again. "Mr. Jameson," she said finally, setting down the axe. "Miss Davis," he replied, dismounting. "I brought some venison, as promised." She approached, surprise evident on her face. "You remembered." "I gave my word," he said simply, as if that explained everything. In his world, it did. He untied the oilcloth packages from his saddle and held them out to her. "There's enough here to last a while if you're careful with it. Some of it's already smoked for keeping." Abigail accepted the packages, her gloved hands brushing against his momentarily. "This is far too generous," she said, examining the contents. "There must be 20 pounds of meat here." Ben shrugged. Buck was big, no sense wasting it. She studied him for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "You must be cold after your ride. Please come in for coffee at least." Common sense told him to decline. He should deliver the meat and be on his way. Getting more involved would only complicate things. Coffee would be welcome, he heard himself say instead. Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. Abigail had made small improvements since his last visit. A colorful quilt now covered the bed, a braided rug softened the plank floor, and dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with a pleasant fragrance. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs while she moved to the stove. "The coffee's already hot." Ben removed his hat and coat, hanging them on a peg by the door, before taking a seat. He watched as she efficiently stored the meat, then poured 2 cups of coffee and joined him at the table. "How did you fare during the storm?" he asked, warming his hands around the cup. "Well enough," she replied. "The cabin is sturdy and I had sufficient firewood, thanks to my uncle's foresight." She took a sip of coffee. "And you, were you out on the ranch or in town?" "At the ranch," he said. "I have a line shack to myself on the southern edge of the property. It's not much, but it keeps the elements at bay." "You've been with the R long?" "4 years now," Ben answered. "Started as a regular hand, worked my way up to foreman of the South Range." Abigail nodded appreciatively. "That's quite an accomplishment for someone so young." "I'm 25, he said, a bit defensively. "Not so young." "I didn't mean to offend," she said with a small smile. "I'm 23 myself. Out here, that's practically ancient for an unmarried woman." The comment hung in the air between them, acknowledging a social reality they both understood. In frontier communities, most women were married by 20, often younger. Those who remained single past that age were often viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "I imagine you had your reasons for coming west alone," Ben said carefully. Abigail's eyes met his, measuring how much to share. "My parents died 3 years ago. Influenza took them both within a week of each other. I was teaching at a small school in Springfield at the time." She paused, taking another sip of coffee. "When I received word of my uncle's passing and the inheritance, it seemed like providence. A chance to start fresh, away from memories and pitying glances." Ben nodded, understanding completely. The West is good for that. No one asks too many questions about your past. "And yours?" she asked. "What brought you to Montana Territory?" He considered deflecting the question but found himself answering honestly. "My mother died when I was 16. My father, he was never the same after. Drank himself to death within 2 years." The words came out flatly, facts stated without emotion. "I headed west when the ground was still fresh on his grave, worked my way up through Wyoming, then Idaho, before settling here." "I'm sorry," she said, and he could tell she meant it. "It's a hard thing, losing family." "It is," he agreed. Then, to change the subject, "How are your fields? Will they produce well come spring?" They spent the next hour talking about practical matters, soil conditions, seasonal rainfall patterns, the best crops for the local climate. Ben found himself impressed by Abigail's knowledge, clearly the result of careful study rather than experience. "My uncle left detailed journals," she explained when he commented on it. "I've been reading them each night, trying to understand this land through his eyes. He farmed here for 20 years. "Smart," Ben acknowledged. "Book learning has its limits, but it's a good foundation." "Says the man who clearly learned everything the hard way," she teased gently. Ben found himself smiling, a rare occurrence. Some lessons stick better when they come with bruises. As the light outside began to fade, he reluctantly rose to leave. "I should head back before dark makes the trail difficult." Abigail walked him to the door. "Thank you again for the venison." "It was incredibly generous." "It was nothing," he said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we all survive." She smiled at that, a knowing look in her green eyes. "Is that what we are?" "Neighbors." The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond. I suppose we are, he finally said, though the triple R is a fair distance from here. Close enough, it seems, she replied. Then more seriously, I appreciate your kindness, Ben, truly. As he rode away, Ben tried to convince himself that he had simply done what any decent man would do. It meant nothing more than that. He had no interest in complications, in forming attachments that would inevitably lead to pain. Yet he couldn't deny the strange lightness in his chest, or the way his thoughts kept returning to Abigail Davis and her small homestead throughout the long ride back to the Triple R. Over the next 2 months, Ben found himself making regular excursions to Abigail's homestead, always with a practical excuse, checking her roof after a heavy snow, bringing more game, helping repair her chicken coop when a windstorm damaged it. Each visit lasted longer than the one before, as coffee led to shared meals, and conversations extended into the evening hours. He learned that she had been engaged once, back in Illinois, to the son of a prominent merchant. Bradford was a good man, she explained one evening as they sat by her fire. Kind, respectful, my parents approved wholeheartedly. What happened? Ben asked, hearing the unspoken remainder of the story in her tone. He died, she said simply. Thrown from a horse 3 weeks before our wedding. The physician said his neck broke instantly. Her hands tightened briefly around her cup. Afterward, there seemed little reason to stay. Too many memories, too many well-meaning people telling me I would find someone else, as if one man could simply replace another. Ben nodded, understanding completely. It was one of the things he appreciated most about Abigail. She didn't fill silences with empty words or platitudes. She understood the value of quiet reflection. And you, she asked after a moment. You never thought of settling down. He stared into the fire, considering how much to reveal. Never saw the point, he said finally. This territory isn't kind to families. Winters are brutal, summers are uncertain. Disease, accidents, outlaws, there are 100 ways to die out here. Seems cruel to bind someone else to that fate. Yet people do it every day, she observed. They marry, have children, build lives together despite the hardships. Perhaps even because of them. Perhaps they're fools, Ben replied, more harshly than he intended. Abigail didn't take offense. Or perhaps they understand something you don't. Their eyes met across the small space, and Ben felt something shift between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither had voiced. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Both started, and Ben instinctively moved his hand toward the revolver at his hip. Are you expecting anyone? He asked quietly. Abigail shook her head, rising from her chair. Ben stood as well, positioning himself between her and the door. Who's there? She called. Marshal Wilkes, Miss Davis, came the reply. Sorry to trouble you so late. Ben relaxed slightly, recognizing the voice of Whitetail Creek's newly appointed lawman. Abigail opened the door to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 30s, a marshal's badge pinned to his coat. Evening, Miss Davis, Wilkes said, tipping his hat. His eyes moved past her to Ben, and his expression shifted subtly. Jameson didn't expect to find you here. Marshal, Ben acknowledged with a nod. He had little interaction with the lawman, but what he knew of Wilkes suggested he was competent and fair-minded, rare qualities for a territorial marshal. What brings you out this way, Marshal? Abigail asked, gesturing for him to enter. Wilkes stepped inside, removing his hat, making the rounds to the outlying homesteads. There's been trouble lately, several properties hit by thieves in the past 2 weeks, mostly food stores and livestock taken. His gaze swept the cabin. Wanted to make sure you were aware and taking precautions. That's concerning, Abigail said. I haven't noticed anything amiss here, but I'll certainly be vigilant. Good, Wilkes replied. They seem to be targeting isolated properties, particularly those occupied by women alone or elderly folks. He glanced at Ben again. Though it appears you have some protection. Mr. Jameson has been kind enough to assist with some repairs, Abigail explained smoothly. The recent storms did considerable damage to my chicken coop. Ben noted her careful phrasing, truthful without revealing the frequency of his visits or the developing nature of their relationship. Whatever that relationship was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. I see, Wilkes said, though his tone suggested he saw more than was being said. Well, I'd advise keeping your doors barred at night, Miss Davis, and perhaps considering a dog if you don't already have one. These thieves seem to avoid properties with dogs. I'll keep that in mind, she replied. After providing a few more details about the thefts and promising to increase patrols in the area, Wilkes departed, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. "He seemed surprised to find you here," Abigail observed, returning to her chair by the fire. Ben resumed his seat as well. "Small communities thrive on gossip. By tomorrow, half the territory will think we're courting." The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Abigail's eyes met his, a question in their depths that he wasn't prepared to answer. "Would that be so terrible?" she asked quietly. Ben looked away into the fire. "It would be complicated." "Life often is," she replied. After a moment she added, "But I have no wish to trap you into anything, Ben. Your friendship these past weeks has been a gift. I don't presume it means more than that." Her graceful offering of an escape route only made him more aware of his conflicted feelings. Part of him wanted to take it, to retreat to the safety of his solitary existence, where attachment couldn't lead to loss. Another part, growing stronger by the day, wanted something he'd denied himself for years. "It's getting late," he said, finally standing. "I should head back." Disappointment flickered across her face before she composed her features. "Of course, thank you again for your help with the coup." As he rode back to the R that night, Ben couldn't escape the feeling that he stood at a crossroads. For years he'd lived by one rule: depend on no one but yourself. It had kept him alive, kept him safe. But increasingly it felt less like protection and more like a prison of his own making. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Ben was in the ranch house, discussing spring cattle movements with the owner, when one of the hands burst in without knocking. "Raiders hit the Davis homestead last night," he announced breathlessly. "Miss Davis was hurt." Ben felt the blood drain from his face. "How bad?" "Don't know details," the hand replied. Marshal Wilkes rode out at dawn when she didn't answer her door, found her unconscious. Took her to Doc Watson's in town. Ben was on his horse within minutes, pushing the animal harder than was wise given the snow-covered trails. His mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. Had he stayed just a little longer the previous night, he might have been there when the raiders came, might have prevented whatever harm had befallen her. Whitetail Creek was unusually active when he arrived. Clusters of townspeople gathered on the boardwalk, speaking in hushed tones. Ben dismounted outside the doctor's office and strode inside without knocking. Dr. Watson, a graying man in his 50s, looked up from his desk with a frown. "Jameson. Should have known you'd come charging in." "How is she?" Ben demanded, ignoring the implied criticism. The doctor's expression softened slightly. "She'll live. Took a nasty blow to the head when she tried to stop them stealing her chickens and winter stores. Has a concussion and needed a few stitches, but she's young and strong." He nodded toward a closed door. "She's resting now." "I want to see her," Ben said, already moving toward the door. "Hold on," Watson said, rising from his chair. "She needs rest more than visitors. Marshal Wilkes is already in there getting her statement." As if summoned by his name, the door opened, and Wilkes emerged. He didn't seem surprised to see Ben. "Jameson," he acknowledged with a nod. "Figured you'd show up sooner rather than later." "What happened?" Ben asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Wilkes gestured for him to follow, leading him to a quiet corner of the outer office. 3 men, based on the tracks, hit sometime after midnight. Miss Davis heard them breaking into her storehouse and went out with a shotgun. His expression was grim. "Brave but foolish. One of them got behind her, struck her with something heavy. They took most of her food stores, her chickens, even the smoked venison she had hanging." The venison Ben had provided. The thought that his gift had made her a target sent a wave of guilt through him. She saw their faces. "No," Wilkes replied, "too dark, and they wore bandanas. But she thinks they were white men, not Indians, based on their builds and the few words she heard." He studied Ben's face. "I know that look, Jameson. Don't even think about going after them yourself. This is my jurisdiction." "You have any leads?" Ben asked, ignoring the warning. "Working on it," the marshal said. "Tracking them is difficult with the fresh snow, but I have some theories." He paused. "Miss Davis is asking for you." Ben's anger was temporarily displaced by concern. "She's awake." "Has been for about an hour," Wilkes confirmed. "Go on in, but keep it brief. Doctor says she needs rest." Ben nodded and made his way to the inner door, knocking softly before entering. The sight of Abigail in the narrow bed nearly undid him. Her face was pale against the white pillow, a bandage wrapped around her forehead. A vivid bruise darkened one cheek. Despite her condition, she attempted a smile when she saw him. "Ben," she said, her voice weaker than normal. "You came." He moved to her bedside, removing his hat. "Of course I came." He wanted to take her hand, but hesitated, unsure of the boundaries between them. "How are you feeling?" "Like I lost an argument with the business end of a shovel," she replied, with a ghost of her usual humor. "But I'll live, according to Dr. Watson." "You should never have confronted them," Ben said, unable to keep the concern from his voice. "Your life is worth more than chickens and supplies." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but those supplies were my livelihood." Without them, she didn't finish the thought. "We'll figure something out," Ben said firmly. "The important thing is that you recover." Abigail studied his face. "The marshal says I can't return to the homestead for at least a week. Doctor's orders. And even then, I shouldn't be alone, in case of complications from the head injury." Ben understood the unspoken question. "You'll stay at the R, he decided. "I'll speak with Mr. Richards. There's a small cabin near the main house where his sister stays when she visits. It's comfortable and close enough that someone can check on you regularly." Relief crossed her features. "I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," he interrupted. "And it's only temporary until you're well enough to return to your claim." What Ben didn't say was that he had no intention of letting her return to that isolated homestead alone, not with raiders still at large. But that was a conversation for another time when she was stronger. "Thank you," she said softly. Her eyes began to drift closed, the conversation clearly taxing her limited strength. "Rest now," he said, gently adjusting the blanket over her. "I'll make the arrangements and return later." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Ben." He looked back to find her watching him through half-closed eyes. "Yes." "I'm glad you're here," she murmured before sleep claimed her. Those simple words followed him as he left the doctor's office and made his way to his horse. She was glad he was here. The thought stirred something in his chest that he'd long believed dormant. Over the following days, Ben divided his time between his duties at the R and ensuring Abigail's comfort at the ranch. Mr. Richards, a widower in his 50s who had always treated Ben more as a son than an employee, readily agreed to provide sanctuary for the injured woman. "It's the decent thing to do," Richards said gruffly. "Besides, winter's no time for a woman to be alone in this territory, especially one who's been targeted once already." Ben arranged for the guest cabin to be prepared, and personally escorted Abigail from town when Dr. Watson declared her fit to travel. The short journey exhausted her more than she wanted to admit, but Ben could see the pallor of her skin and the way she swayed slightly in the saddle despite his supportive arm around her waist. The guest cabin was small but well appointed, with a comfortable bed, a sturdy table and chairs, a cast iron stove, and even a few books on a small shelf. Richard's housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, had prepared the space with a woman's touch, fresh linens on the bed, a vase of dried wildflowers on the table, and a kettle of broth simmering on the stove. "It's too much," Abigail protested weakly as Ben helped her inside. "I don't deserve such kindness from strangers." "Neighbors," he corrected, echoing their earlier conversation. "Out here, neighbors look after each other." For the next week, Ben visited the cabin twice daily, bringing meals prepared by Mrs. Holloway and staying to ensure Abigail ate properly. They talked for hours about books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had harbored. With each conversation, the walls Ben had built around himself crumbled a little more. "You never said much about your mother," Abigail observed one evening as they sat by the fire. Her strength was returning steadily, though she still tired easily. "What was she like?" Ben stared into the flames, memories surfacing that he rarely allowed himself to revisit. "She was remarkable," he said finally, "strong but gentle. She could break a wild horse in the morning and bake the most delicate biscuits you ever tasted by afternoon." A half-smile touched his lips. "She loved poetry. Used to read Wordsworth and Keats by candlelight after my father and I were asleep. I caught her at it once, and after that, she would sometimes read to me when we were alone." "She sounds wonderful," Abigail said softly. "She was," Ben agreed. "When she died, it was like all the light went out of our home. My father never recovered from losing her." His expression hardened. "That's why I decided long ago not to risk it, that kind of attachment, that kind of loss." Abigail was quiet for a moment, considering his words. So you chose emptiness over the possibility of pain, she said finally. It wasn't a judgment, merely an observation. I chose survival, Ben countered. Is survival enough? She asked, her green eyes searching his face. Is that truly living, Ben? He had no answer for her. Or rather, the answer that rose to his mind frightened him with its clarity. No, it isn't enough, not anymore. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Ben rose to answer it, finding Marshal Wilkes on the threshold. "Evening, Jameson," the lawman said, stamping snow from his boots. "Miss Davis, hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Abigail assured him. "Please come in out of the cold." Wilkes entered, removing his hat. "I have news about the raiders," he announced without preamble. "We caught one of them trying to sell Miss Davis's chickens in Helena. Fellow named Carver. He gave up his partners quick enough when faced with hanging." "You have them in custody?" Ben asked. "Two of them," Wilkes confirmed. "The third, their leader, a man called Slater, escaped, but we recovered some of the stolen goods." He glanced at Abigail. "Your shotgun and some of your preserved foods are at my office in town. The chickens, I'm afraid, are long gone." "That's something at least," she said. "Thank you, Marshal." "There's more," Wilkes continued, his expression grave. "Slater was overheard in a saloon in Helena, drunk and talking too much. He's taken your raid personally, Miss Davis. Seems he considers it an insult that a woman would stand against him. He was making threats." Ben felt a cold fury building inside him. "What kind of threats?" "The kind that suggest he might return to finish what he started," Wilkes said bluntly. "I've increased patrols around your homestead, Miss Davis, but I can't spare men to guard it around the clock." "I understand," Abigail said, her face pale but composed. "I'm telling you this not to frighten you," Wilkes continued, "but to ensure you take proper precautions. I'd advise against returning to your homestead alone, at least until Slater is apprehended." After the marshal departed, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Ben paced by the fire, anger and concern warring within him. "I won't be driven from my home by threats," Abigail said finally, her voice steady despite the fear Ben could see in her eyes. "No one's suggesting that," he replied. "But the marshal is right, it's not safe for you to return alone." "What choice do I have?" she asked. "I can't impose on Mr. Richards' hospitality indefinitely, and my claim. If I abandon it for too long, I could lose everything my uncle built." Ben stopped pacing and faced her directly. "There is another option," he said, the words coming before he could reconsider them. "Marry me." Abigail stared at him, clearly stunned by the abrupt proposal. "What?" Now committed, Ben pressed on. "Marry me. I'll move to your homestead, help you work the land. Between your claim and my savings, we could build something good. Something lasting." "Ben," she said carefully, "while I'm deeply touched by your offer, I can't accept marriage as a solution to a temporary problem." "Is that what you think this is?" he asked, genuinely confused. "A practical arrangement." "Isn't it?" she countered. "You've never spoken of feelings. Ben never indicated that you wanted anything more than friendship between us. And now, faced with a threat to my safety, you suddenly propose marriage." Put that way, Ben could see how his offer might appear. "I didn't explain myself well," he acknowledged. "The truth is, Abigail, these past months, you've changed something in me, something I thought was permanently broken." He moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, afraid that caring for you meant risking the same devastation that destroyed my father." Her expression softened. "Oh, Ben. But I realize now that I was already lost," he continued. "That day in town, when I first saw you turned away from Donovan's store, something in me recognized something in you. I've been fighting it ever since, but I can't anymore." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Abigail Davis, and yes, it terrifies me, but the thought of losing you without ever having told you terrifies me more." Tears welled in her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, "but marriage, it's such a serious step, are you certain?" "More certain than I've been about anything," he assured her, "but if you need time to consider." She silenced him by leaning forward and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Is that a yes?" Ben asked, hope rising in his chest. Abigail smiled, the most radiant expression he had ever seen on her face. Yes, Benjamin Jameson, I will marry you, not because I need protection, but because I love you and want to build a life with you. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Whitetail Creek. The entire community turned out for the event: ranchers, shopkeepers, homesteaders who had come to know and respect Abigail during her months in the territory. Mr. Richards stood as Ben's best man, while Mrs. Holloway attended Abigail. The bride wore a simple blue dress that brought out the green of her eyes, with wildflowers in her chestnut hair. Ben, unaccustomed to formal attire, endured a new suit and collar for the occasion. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady and sure, all doubt having fled in the face of the certainty that this woman was his future. After the ceremony, they returned to the R for a celebration hosted by Mr. Richards. As the afternoon waned, Ben found a moment alone with his new wife on the porch of the main house. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace, "though I confess to some nervousness about returning to the homestead, not because of Slater," she added quickly, "but because it will truly be the beginning of our life together." "We'll face it together," Ben promised. "Whatever comes." What came the very next morning was unexpected. They had planned to travel to the homestead after breakfast, their few possessions packed and ready. Ben was checking the wagon one final time when a rider approached at a gallop, one of the hands from the South Range. "Jameson," the man called as he reined in his lathered horse. "Fire at the Davis place, saw the smoke from the ridge." Ben's blood ran cold. "Abigail," he said, turning to find his wife already hurrying toward them, having heard the commotion. "We need to go," she said, her face pale but determined. "Now." They rode hard, Ben on his horse and Abigail in the wagon, driven by one of the ranch hands. As they crested the final rise before her property, the devastation became clear. The cabin was engulfed in flames, black smoke billowing into the clear morning sky. The barn and storehouse had already collapsed into smoldering ruins. "No," Abigail whispered as Ben helped her from the wagon. "Everything. It's all gone." As they watched helplessly, the cabin's roof caved in with a crash of burning timbers. Nothing could be saved. "This was deliberate," Ben said, fury building inside him as he noted the systematic destruction. "Slater." As if summoned by the name, a rider appeared on the far side of the clearing, watching them from the shelter of the trees. Even at a distance, Ben could make out the man's smug posture, the casual way he sat his horse while observing their despair. "Stay here," Ben told Abigail, moving toward his horse. She grabbed his arm. Ben knew he could be armed, waiting for exactly this. "I can't let him get away with this," Ben argued, his voice tight with rage. "And I can't lose you," she countered fiercely. "Not now, not like this." Their standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Marshal Wilkes and 2 deputies, who had seen the smoke from town. Wilkes took in the situation at a glance, including the lone rider watching from the trees. "Slater," he said grimly, drawing his pistol. "Jameson, stay with your wife, we'll handle this." The 3 lawmen spurred their horses toward the distant figure, who wheeled his mount and disappeared into the forest. The sound of gunfire echoed through the trees moments later. Ben held Abigail close as they waited, watching their dreams burn to ashes before their eyes. The homestead that was to be their future lay in ruins, years of work destroyed in a single act of malice. "Everything my uncle built," Abigail said softly, tears streaming down her face. "Everything I hoped to build with you, gone." "Not everything," Ben said, turning her to face him. "We still have each other. We can rebuild, start fresh." "Where?" she asked. "This was all I had, Ben. The deed to this land was in the cabin, along with what little money I'd saved." Before Ben could respond, hoofbeats announced the return of Wilkes and his deputies. The marshal's grim expression told the story before he spoke. "He got away," Wilkes said, dismounting, "for now, but he's wounded. My deputy winged him in the shoulder. He won't get far." "That's little consolation," Ben replied, gesturing to the destroyed homestead. Wilkes nodded in understanding. "I'm sorry, folks, truly, but we'll find him, I promise you that." He surveyed the smoldering ruins. "In the meantime, you'll need some place to stay." "They'll return to the R," said a new voice. "Mr. Richards rode into the clearing, having followed when he heard the news, for as long as necessary. Ben looked to Abigail, who nodded gratefully through her tears. As they prepared to leave the ruined homestead, Abigail paused, staring at the still smoking remnants of the cabin. "There's something I need to check," she said suddenly, "something my uncle told me about." Before Ben could stop her, she was walking toward the ruins, careful to avoid still burning embers. She moved to a spot near what had been the back wall of the cabin and began clearing debris with a fallen branch. "Abigail, it's not safe," Ben called, starting after her. "Just a moment," she replied, focused on her task. After several minutes of clearing, she revealed a small metal door set into the ground, a root cellar or storm shelter of some kind. The fire had passed over it, but the metal door, though scorched, remained intact. With Ben's help, she pulled the door open, revealing a short ladder leading down into darkness. "My uncle mentioned a shelter beneath the cabin," she explained. "Said it was for tornadoes, but I wonder." Ben fetched a lantern from the wagon and followed her down the ladder. The space below was small but solidly constructed, with shelves along one wall, and on those shelves, protected from the fire above, were jars of preserved food, tools, blankets, and a small metal box. Abigail opened the box with trembling hands. Inside lay the deed to the property, various legal documents, and a canvas pouch that clinked when she lifted it. "Gold eagles," she said in disbelief, opening the pouch to reveal several coins. "My uncle's savings, he must have hidden them here for safekeeping." She looked at Ben, hope dawning in her eyes. "We can rebuild, Ben. We haven't lost everything after all." That night, as they sat before the fire in their temporary quarters at the R, they made plans. The gold coins, while not a fortune, would provide enough to start again, to build a new cabin, replace essential tools and livestock, and see them through until the next harvest. "I've been thinking," Ben said as they discussed their options. "The south range of the R borders your land. Richards has been talking about selling that section, says it's too far from the main ranch to manage efficiently." He took her hand. "With your uncle's gold and my savings, we could buy it. Combine it with your claim to create a ranch of our own." Abigail's eyes widened at the possibility. "Do you think Mr. Richards would sell to us?" "I know he would," Ben replied confidently. "He's already offered me first refusal if I ever wanted to strike out on my own." He squeezed her hand. "What do you think? It wouldn't just be your uncle's legacy anymore, or my dream alone. It would be ours together." The smile that spread across Abigail's face was answer enough. "I think it sounds perfect," she said. "Our own piece of Montana." Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Ben answered to find Marshal Wilkes, his expression solemn but satisfied. "We got him," the lawman announced without preamble. "Slater. He tried to steal a horse in town, but his wounds slowed him down. He's in my jail now, facing charges for arson, theft, assault, and attempted murder." Wilkes removed his hat. "Thought you'd want to know right away." "Thank you, Marshal," Abigail said, joining Ben at the door. "That's a relief." Wilkes nodded. "Justice will be served, Mrs. Jameson. You can count on that." He replaced his hat. "Now you folks can focus on rebuilding without looking over your shoulders." After the marshal left, Ben pulled Abigail into his arms. "It's really over," he murmured into her hair. "We can move forward now." "We already were," she replied, looking up at him with love shining in her eyes. "From the moment you saw me turned away from the store and said, 'Come with me, I'll fill your table tonight.' You just didn't know it yet." Ben smiled, remembering that day that now seemed a lifetime ago. "I think part of me did know," he admitted. "I just wasn't ready to admit it." "And now?" she asked, her arms encircling his waist. "Now," he said, lowering his lips to hers, "I can't imagine any other path but this one with you." Spring arrived with a gentle persistence that mirrored Ben and Abigail's determination to build their new life. With Richard's blessing, they purchased the south range of the R, combining it with Abigail's claim to create the Double J Ranch, named for their shared initial. They built their new home on a rise overlooking both properties, a sturdy cabin larger and more comfortable than either of their previous dwellings. Ben insisted on a proper foundation and extra reinforcement against the elements. "This one's meant to last," he explained as they worked side by side, "for us and for generations to come." The mention of generations brought a soft smile to Abigail's face, one that held a secret she wasn't quite ready to share. But as spring blossomed into summer and her condition became impossible to conceal, the joy of impending parenthood added new urgency to their efforts. "A baby," Ben had whispered in wonder when she finally told him, his hand gentle on the slight curve of her belly. "Our child," the mixture of elation and terror on his face had made her laugh. "Yes, our child," she'd confirmed. "Due when the winter snows begin, according to Dr. Watson's estimation. Now, as autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, their home was complete, their ranch stocked with cattle purchased from Richards, and their future more secure than either had dared to hope just a year before. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Ben surprised Abigail with a special dinner, venison steaks, fresh bread, and even a pie purchased from Mrs. Holloway. As they sat at their table, enjoying the meal in each other's company, Ben raised his cup in a toast. "To the day I saw you turned away from the store," he said, his eyes warm with love, "the day everything changed." Abigail smiled, one hand resting on her now prominent belly. "The day you promised to fill my table," she replied, raising her own cup. Little did we know how abundantly that promise would be fulfilled. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange and purple, Ben reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a solitary man determined to need no one, to a husband and soon-to-be father with a heart full to bursting, the transformation still amazed him. The frontier was still harsh, the winters still brutal, the future still uncertain in many ways. But facing it together, they had found a strength neither possessed alone. In each other's arms they had discovered not just survival, but truly living. And when the first snows of winter fell, bringing with them the cries of their newborn daughter, a perfect child with her mother's chestnut hair and her father's determined chin, Benjamin Jameson finally understood what his father had known all along. That some risks were worth taking, some pains worth enduring, for the incomparable joy of loving completely.